Thanks everyone for joining us today. I am Joel Gordon with Zerion Group, and with me here is Tony King at Zerion Group. And we wanted to talk to you a little bit today about what happens when EOQ runs out. Specifically, we're going to be looking at an in-depth look at Epicor's Eclipse demand planning. So Tony, before we get started, why don't you introduce yourself and kind of explain a little bit about your history in Eclipse, history in distribution, and kind of go from there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Joel. Appreciate that. So my history with Eclipse and distribution, let's see. I started back in 2000-ish working for a company called Hughes Supply. And I had a couple of different jobs there. I was in the internal audit department, and then I was in the electrical inventory department as well. But ultimately, I ended up on the so-called Eclipse installation team. And so I was on the internal consulting team that was employed to convert all of their systems onto Eclipse. So at that point in time, they had, I think 45 or 50 different ERPs at Hughes Supply, which was insane. And we needed to shut all those down and convert them all over to Eclipse. So I was on the team that helped did that. We did that for multiple years and shut down 45 systems or so across 350 locations. So I was on that team. That's kind of where I learned Eclipse itself and got a lot of the experience that I have today from Eclipse. And over the years, I've just built on one thing or another. But in 2005, I'd only been at Hughes for just, I guess, 4 or 5 years, and decided that after we had finished doing all the installations at Hughes, that I kind of was out of a job, and I probably need to figure that out. So I could go be a branch manager, I could go be a sales guy, and I kind of had my choice because they were all on Eclipse and I knew the system, but none of those really worked for me. So I decided that I should just start my own company. And I gathered a couple of other really good guys around me and came up with this idea to launch Zerion Group. Essentially, we were firing all of us and going out on our own. So we basically fired all the installation crew and started our own business. We started with one customer, something that I would not recommend that people do. And I recommend you do that with a little bit more thorough, thought out plan than what we did. But I was 25 at the time and ready to conquer the world. So anyhow, I guess it's 2020 now. I'm working on year 16. We've got 550 plus Eclipse accounts, and we function with about 18 or 20 different people on our team, doing tons of integration work and trying to move at the fast pace of distribution that it's going today. So appreciate your time with us today, Joel. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. And it's so interesting, even the topic of this whole conference and what this is about, and navigating chaos with confidence. And it sounds like you had to do that kind of trial by fire style as you're onboarding all these other systems and branches and converting them into Eclipse, which was not owned by Epicor at the time. So you've even seen transitions of Eclipse from hand to hand, company to company as well. But you kind of had a first perspective view into a lot of the challenges that goes on with Eclipse itself. And so I love the topic of this whole conference and kind of what the theme of it is, the navigating chaos with confidence, because it's so familiar for Eclipse customers to have that level of chaos and what's going on, and how do you keep up with the demands of a very fast-paced world. What you did 16 years ago, there's been a lot of commerce change just since then. We've talked a little bit about e-commerce and how that affects demand planning and some other things, but what are some things that you've just noticed in Eclipse from 16 years ago to now that just changes the game when it comes to really thinking about purchasing and demand planning and things like that of that nature with Eclipse?
Whew. I mean, that's a loaded question, but yeah. Hey, by the way, Tony, go ahead and ask a question about Eclipse that spans 3 decades and tell me what is better now, right?
You got that. No big deal.
I'll try. First of all, any of the stuff I talk about in the beginning of Eclipse, keep in mind that I just found the system and started working it in 2020. So any of the historical type of references is, I guess, somewhat hearsay. Hear it from different people, and at times the original architect of Eclipse talked to him on multiple different occasions. So just piecing together the stories. But I mean, I like to start that discussion around a few different ideas. And one of those ideas is that there were some things at that time in the 90s, because Eclipse was originally sold, I think the first deal was done in 1991. There were some things that are around today that were not around then, and they just are. They would be more considered to be a foundational layer of what we deal with today that just weren't there then. And I'm going to start with the internet. The internet wasn't really what it is today. And so they were making plans and doing stuff as best they could, but things were moving faster than you could get an ERP updated to change with. So every time you made a change, you literally couldn't really keep up with what it then needed to do. So the internet was not there as it is today. Amazon, expectations on the web, Apple. I mean, these types of behemoths, and Google too, right? Like they just weren't there. And the reason why I point them out is because they are just such a massive influence on our expectations with e-commerce, our expectations with computers and software and experience, right? I mean, I'm still amazed at how well the Amazon app itself works, and yet it's not pretty. I wouldn't consider it a good-looking app. I would consider it extremely functional, extremely easy, and it's such an easy thing to go to. The other thing that I would think about too, and when you and I were talking, kind of prepping for this discussion, Joel, I didn't even bring this up, but an app store, right? We tend to feel like everything should be plug and play, and we have that experience for even applications that are going to revolutionize our ability to function in our business. So like we think, oh, is there an app for that? Oh, I should be able to go to this place and get this. I can go to Microsoft and get this. I can go to Apple and get this. And you have this sense of feeling that you're going to be able to just download an app and like just solve a business problem. And shockingly enough, that's usually the case. So like let's create that polarizing moment and just say, okay, 1990s ERP installation, shutting down a mainframe, shutting down the server that's in my closet, putting a different one, a super fast one on a multi-valued database, ready to rock and roll, and I'm still going to keep it in my closet. Today, I've got lots of software out there and lots of applications that I can download and put on my phone that just can revolutionize my life, my ability to function, work, etc. So those are just kind of some of the things that just make today's day and age so different than what we were dealing with in the 90s when it comes to ERP development and production and what we expected.
Yeah, and I love where you're going there too, and how you're talking about, hey, there's a mainframe type architecture that's in place with dealing with some of these older ERPs, but in particular Eclipse, and then how cloud computing has really changed the name of the game. Cloud computing, and then also the little phrase 2-day shipping. When 2-day shipping was introduced by Amazon, that created, I mean, that was shattering to the foundations of brick and mortar businesses.
Oh my gosh. What about next day or same day? They have same day delivery. It's unbelievable.
Oh, it's only getting worse. Yeah, and or better for the consumers, right? But these are increasingly more difficult problems to solve from a consumer expectation perspective. And that's not just B2C anymore. That's B2B expectations as well, right? So we've got an older ERP that now has to keep up with understanding that from a forecast perspective, and then the business challenges of keeping up with the demands of that from just warehouse optimizations, and we've talked ad nauseum about that before. But before we get to the specific components of the multi-value database that you talked about, and how integrations with that, it can be a little bit tricky at times. Let's get to that in a second, but let's talk about a little bit about the actual problems with demand planning native inside Eclipse as an ERP system, and why applications like Blue Ridge can really kind of extend and provide immediate value to the distributors to be able to meet those consumer demands.
Yeah. So I've had a lot of time to stew on that, but not just because you wanted to record me doing it or to talking about it, but because it's just been something that's been on my head for, I guess, quite some time. So there's a few things, just kind of rambling through my head real quick, there's a few things that kind of stand out when I think about Eclipse and demand planning and just trying to get ahead of the game. I do want to reference back to what we're talking about Amazon and the next day shipment and that sort of thing too, is that this expectation has been built in the retail mindset, right? And I say the retail not because we're not in retail and we're in wholesale, but because every one of us lives on the retail side to some degree. Like we're all buying retail pricing on something, some goodish service, and like we're doing that and interacting with other companies at a retail level. We're not all living in the supply world. So we have this retail expectation of what's going to be done for me, and that retail expectation is you can have it today. And that in the wholesale world is just really, really complicated and difficult to deal with. There's so much planning and so much execution that has to be done just in order to even get close to what that expectation is. And a lot of times we can't compete with it. We can't compete with what is being presented in front of us. So we have to figure out another way around it. But the reason why I tell you that is because there are those expectations are there, and we have to deal with those. But those weren't there in the 90s. And one of the simpler examples that I have to talk about is the counter business. And tons and tons of supply houses across the country. I mean, a lot of our customers have showrooms / counters, will call orders, will call counters, that sort of thing. But places where the contractors are coming in to pick up material. And if we remember back to the 90s, which I wasn't in the business at that point, but I saw a lot of it in the early 2000s, was the contractor would come in to the counter a lot of times, get a cup of coffee, maybe a donut, something like that, and want to pick up some material. They'd usually be picking up that material for the day's jobs, maybe the week's jobs, filling up their own inventory in their truck or something. But they were doing that to fill orders that they needed in order to do the work. And what happened was there was a big consolidation event that was happening in the broader scope of distribution where we were gobbling up people, merging them, making these bigger companies. And what happened was instead of being able to, like when we didn't have the material at that supply house that counter was supposed to have, a lot of times that customer would just come back. And they would just come back because they weren't going to go down the street to go get it from somewhere else. They weren't going to just pick up their phone and get it delivered tomorrow, even though it was going to be a higher price. They weren't going to go to Lowe's or Home Depot, although that in the early 2000s, obviously that was starting to come into play, but it was just way different than where we are now. But it was just this like, hey, I can come back later and get it. Well, so back in the day, all we did was we'd pad the purchase order. And we just pad it because that guy's going to come back or that lady is going to come back next week to get that material. So that's just kind of how we handled it. And that inherently was at a fundamental level was just something that was there. The other thing was we in Eclipse specifically, like we've always leaned on the EOQ, the economic order quantity. And that calculation, although widely used and super successful, has just not necessarily been everything that the supply houses needed. And what I mean by that is at its core, we depended on that from the mid 90s, but there's a lot of applications out there today, Blue Ridge being one of those, that from a what if analysis, or like, what if we did this? What if we did that? What if we applied this other formula to these products? Would we be better at predicting them for the future? So Eclipse has a little bit of that built in, where in the last 5 or 6 years where they've have some more advanced features. But if you go look at a really solid advanced demand planning solution in the market today, you're going to see what if analysis. You're going to see many, many, many different formulas to be used to calculate good demand for those products. And they're going to be running it through multiple different options. So those are a couple things. The other one I really don't want to miss is containers. And Eclipse has long had this problem that we have targets in Eclipse that we try to shoot for to be able to fulfill essentially a freight prepaid minimum, but it's always going to overshoot that. And one of those things is containers, and containers from I call it the slow boat. But when we're buying and we're buying from vendors that are overseas, and they're going to ship it to us, they're not going to air freight it. They're going to ship it to us. It's got to fit in a container. And a lot of times we are trying to truly maximize what is going to be on that container to what we actually need. Now, there's a couple problems with that. One, just from a native Eclipse issue, is Eclipse always overshoots that target. Well, when you overshoot that target, like the container's not made of rubber, like you can't expand it. You've got to figure out what is going to fit. So essentially that means that whoever's doing the purchasing for that slow boat order, you've got to do some calculations outside of Eclipse. So it's not inherently there natively for a purchasing agent to be able to use and use well. It takes extra complication. So to apply that to what we're talking about here, Joel, is I would say fundamentally back in the mid 90s, we weren't all as a collective whole trying to get material from over on the slow boat, right? Like we weren't trying to procure the material always in that manner. But so many supply houses and so many distributors nowadays are dealing with that. And those are really, really critical, because if you look at some businesses that require 80 or 90% of the material coming from overseas and importing it in, the problem with that is that you can't just edit that order. Like when that product is on the ship in a container in the middle of the Atlantic, you can't edit it. I mean, you could edit it in the system, but that's not going to do you any good. The order, it's stuck. It's stuck. I mean, like that is what it is. So like the only thing you can do is get another slow boat order. So if you're going to miss out on customers' expectations on those orders, it's a big deal. And that brings in line with Blue Ridge and just demand planning in general, is that it needs to be an entirely comprehensive plan to execute well so that we're delivering on the customer expectations. And that's where I see Blue Ridge really shining with what we've got natively in Eclipse.
Yeah, and in kind of, so you said that perfectly, and it kind of sets the stage for moving into the next topic that goes along with that. Is, so now you have this ERP full of amazing historical data, but that data is stored and referenced in a non-normalized multi-value database way. So it's built off of universe multi-value database. And then you have all these tools, these great tools, Blue Ridge, that normalizes that data and puts that into algorithms that make more sense, that can do that what if analysis, that can do much more advanced modeling based on demand planning and forecasting. But there's a challenge there inherently right out of the gate with Eclipse. How do we get this Eclipse data which is great and has so much historical connotations for us to make smart decisions? How do we get that into a tool like Blue Ridge for them to do their analysis and help distributors immediately? So what sorts of challenges do we have navigating the chaos of the data, so to speak, with Eclipse to Blue Ridge and back and forth?
Yeah, so before I answer that question, Joel, I was just thinking about something that I do want to clarify is before I get into the next piece, I do want to make sure that our listeners are understanding that there are absolutely other things that you can bolt on to universe systems, Eclipse, other things. Like there are solutions out there. But I want to paint a picture for you. Is we as a whole, so many of us are running on these ERPs that are a bit dated. And they're getting better. They're getting improved. Like I'm not saying that the software vendors are not putting time and effort and R&D into them. They absolutely are. And a lot of times they're making huge strides, which is great. It's amazing for everybody, right? But if you could imagine if I started building a home or some structure in, let's just be, let's exaggerate for a second. I started building this home in 1920. And I did my best to put the best concrete in there, the best framing, the best nails. But when the 40s and 50s came along, there were better options. So now I'm going to add another story. And I'm going to add another story, but I'm not going to use the materials from back then. I'm going to use what's available to me now. Well, then the 70s come along and I do it again. I'm going to add the third story now, right? And I've got a better story on the third story. And when I get to the fourth story, now I'm going to put an even better fourth story on it in the 2000s. Well, I've now got four stories of different generations with different abilities and whatnot. But now, lo and behold, 2020 comes along, and I'm going to put new siding on the house. And I've put nice icing around the entire house. And it looks beautiful, but like foundationally at the very bottom in the dirt on the first floor, I've got a 1920s house. And unless I gutted it, like that's just what I have. So I do want to make sure that you guys understand that there are options and there are things that you can add on. But I'm not talking about putting a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I'm saying that fundamentally at some layer with all of the ERPs out there, like you have these like building blocks that just you fall short with. So that's what I'm talking about with Blue Ridge, that it is a system that what we're going to do is we're going to take data out of it, we're going to give it to somebody else, and we're going to put the purchase orders back in it. And in order to do that and do it well, you've got to do it in a way that both the extraction side and the Blue Ridge side, both of them, it works well for both of them. And that's exactly, I mean, that's where Joel's coming in. That's the question is, how do we go about doing that? And I think earlier when we were talking about it, Joel was talking about being the funnel. Zerion is this like integration funnel, right? And we're basically translating this multi-value data set into what I would consider to be a relational data set. Almost all of the databases out there, so much of what is done development-wise is done in fully relational data sets. And that's fine. Like that is where a lot of the society from an IT standpoint is. But the multi-value world is amazing. It is screaming fast. It does amazing things. It goes through so much data. There's a ton of cool stuff you can do with it. And what we do is we take this multi-value database where you have values that are not 100% relational to another field. We shove it through this funnel that all of a sudden translates it to make sense to somebody like Blue Ridge to be able to put it into their system and actually do something with it. And we've seen so many different customers of ours at times try to write a report and integrate with a third party or do this or do that. And it works fine, but it's no different than if you like you're doing the best that you can in any situation in your life. Like you're taking the tool set that you have, you're going to try to execute as best you can, and then you're going to apply that. Well, same thing in this is the case. You're going to write a report in Report Writer. You're going to do an extraction manually. You're going to give it to the vendor. It may or may not be the same all the time. Who knows? But you're doing the best you can and honorably. But with Zerion, what happens is we spend a lot of time dissecting the data, making sure that it's right, putting it in programs, doing the extraction, automating it all so that every single time, night in and night out, Blue Ridge gets the right information the same day as yesterday. And it's what the customer is expecting. The wholesalers, the purchasing agents, they can execute well every single day and get their job done. And they can function without anybody else involved. And that's the beauty of it. And we take that that multi-value data and put it through our integration funnel, as I would call it, to be able to deliver it well to somebody like Blue Ridge. And that's the value that we put forth.
Yeah, and it's such a good analogy too of the house, and understanding the foundational layers of that data is so important, because otherwise you do get into a situation where, in order for Blue Ridge to be effective, they need to rely on and count on that data being accurate and well represented and understood as far as its context, where it came from, what does its history mean. And so that's kind of to tie it back to your analogy in the beginning here. It's like understanding the foundation. It's understanding what happened in the 1920s when they built the foundation, to know that when you continue to build up on this, that you're going to be able to do so without the house and the foundation crumbling. So it's the mentality of really making sure that there's not a garbage in, garbage out situation, where the data is fully understood, fully well mapped, so the integration itself can give Blue Ridge the horsepower that it really needs to do its job well in suggesting and doing these business operations for these distributors. I think that's a great example. Well, Tony, we're kind of wrapping up towards the end of our time. What's some other bits of information that you would want, anybody that's operating on an Eclipse system or even other ERP systems to know, as they're doing integration work, as they're doing the hard work of understanding that data for demand planning? What are some other things that you might want them to know as we kind of close out?
Well, you kind of sprung that question on me, but
I
let me think here for a second.
Man.
Look, I mean, there was a good friend of mine back at Hughes, in the Hughes Supply days when I was younger, and way, way, way overconfident. And of course, I knew everything, and I didn't know anything, by the way. I was just a knucklehead. But anyways, there's this guy, and he said to me one time, "There's only one good type of data, or actually, I think he said one type of maintenance." And he said, it's good maintenance. And that's a little bit of slang for those of us that are in the Eclipse world, because we have vendor maintenance, product maintenance, customer maintenance, ship via maintenance, like all these things. They're actually called maintenance, GL maint. Anyways, he said there's only one type of maintenance, and it's good maintenance. And his point was similar to the garbage in, garbage out. It's like, you can only function as well as your data set. So we spend hours and hours and hours and gobs of time validating what is in the data versus what the customer or the distributor thinks is there. Both validating it, rationalizing it, fixing it, and also teaching the customer or the distributor what it actually does, what Eclipse actually does. So what I would say this: if you want to make any integration go well for you, whether it's Blue Ridge or anything else, your data matters. It has to be right. You can't live in the e-commerce world if you don't have good product file data. And it can't be 95% perfect on 95% of the products. Like, you got to be really close to batting 1,000 for the products that you're going to put out in front of everybody. The same thing for demand planning. You can't plan your inventory and plan well or give the purchasing agents the tools that they need if your data is just 85% good, because you're only going to have 85% awesomeness on the Blue Ridge side. I mean, you're already deficient in what your capability is. So I think the one takeaway I'd give everybody is, like, you got to have great data, great maintenance. You got to get your house in order before you ever start something like Blue Ridge.
That's so good. We could have easily started there with the data. I kind of love that we ended with the data too, because it's the hard work that really does lay the foundation for a successful integration project, so that Blue Ridge and demand planning can work well on your behalf. but it is that hard work that needs to be done before you can really be successful with that. And that's even true with just the native inherent tool sets that are embedded in the ERP. Anyway, you still need to have that data, and so the hard work of maintaining that is important. And that's absolutely what we do, and what our team does at Zerion as well. Well, thank you everybody for taking the time today. You could be so many other places, but you're here and you're listening to this.
Listen to Joel and T.
It's great. Yeah, Joel and Tony.
Sorry for their loss. I will not give you your time back.
Yeah, you can't. You can't. It's gone. It's gone. You literally just had whatever, 35 minutes of time with us. But thank you so much for joining. If you want to contact us at all and learn more about Eclipse integration specifically with Blue Ridge, please do reach out. We'll have our contact information posted. Tony, thank you so much for taking the time. It was great to be with you all today at this Blue Ridge Blueprint Conference. And maybe next year or sometime in the future, we'll all be able to do this face-to-face again, and it'll be great to see everybody.